A question for Madam Chair. You've spent the last hour talking about integrity, values, the kind of company we want to be. So I'm curious, does your son know his father's name? Because the rest of us certainly don't. Or is that information above our pay grade?
She walked off the stage, pulled her heels off at the service door. 3 floors down, machine oil, rust, then a small voice through a door.
Moving to mechanical, boss wants her face on camera, rough, before she has time to think.
They're not looking for him, they're looking for you.
Why are you protecting me?
Because if they get that photo, you lose everything.
You gave up the right to care 6 years ago.
He didn't answer.
The Vail Urban Development Gala was held on the 48th floor of the company's newest tower in downtown Boston, where glass walls looked down over the harbor as if the city itself were only a blueprint laid beneath the feet of investors. Serena Vail stood at the podium in a black gown cut sharply at the shoulders, her hair pinned low, a slim watch on her wrist that she had bought with her first bonus after becoming CEO. Behind her was the company logo. In front of her were hundreds of guests, media cameras, major shareholders, city officials, and the kind of people who always knew how to smile when profits went up. She had just finished speaking about the mixed-income housing project in South Boston when the largest shareholder stepped up from the row on the right. He didn't snatch the microphone. He asked to speak in a polite voice, the kind of politeness used by a man who had already sharpened the knife and was only looking for the right place to put it. On the screen, the revenue chart stayed frozen behind Serena. Below the stage, her son sat in the front row, his small feet not touching the floor, both hands wrapped around a toy flashlight because he didn't like rooms with too many people. The attack came dressed up as concern about the leadership image. The shareholders spoke about business ethics, public trust, and how a CEO had to be a role model for the next generation. Then he dragged the question to its filthiest point. His voice carried through the microphone system, clear enough for the people at the back of the room to hear every syllable when he asked how Serena planned to teach anyone about ethics when she didn't even know who the father was of the bastard child she had been hiding at home. The room didn't explode. It froze. Serena felt her teeth cut into her lip, the thin taste of blood spreading across her tongue. She didn't lift a hand to wipe it. She had lived for 5 years under whispers like that, in private elevators, at business clubs, and on internal forums where people pretended to talk about governance while really counting the mistakes in her personal life. But they had never been thrown straight at her son in front of cameras. Serena's eyes left the shareholder and shot down to the front row. The small chair beside her communications advisor was empty. The toy flashlight had fallen under the seat, its battery cover popped open, and one battery rolled against the table leg. She stayed at the podium for another second. Everything inside her wanted to run down immediately, but hundreds of cameras were waiting for a breakdown. If she panicked, tomorrow morning's headline wouldn't be about a child being humiliated. It would be about a female CEO losing control at a gala. The shareholder knew that. He hadn't only struck her. He had struck her in the one place where she had to stand straight. Serena placed both hands on the edge of the podium, her nails pressing into the polished wood. She said a few short sentences about how the company wouldn't turn the private life of a child into entertainment for any shareholder. Her voice stayed even, but her eyes kept scanning the exits. When her communications advisor leaned toward the stage, Serena only had to glance at her for the woman to understand. A group of security staff began moving toward the side hall. Serena left the podium as soon as she could without turning the room into chaos. The whispers clung to her like wet fabric. Some people moved out of her way. Some lowered their phones and kept recording. She walked quickly past the cocktail tables, past full glasses, past a sponsor calling her name in a voice that pretended to be worried. At the back door, she pulled off her high heels, held them in one hand, and ran. The service hallway behind the ballroom no longer smelled like wine and perfume. It smelled of damp carpet, hot wiring, and industrial cleaner. Serena ran past servers pushing carts of dirty glasses, past the freight elevator, and past signs pointing down to the mechanical level. Her bare feet hit the cold concrete floor, each step catching the expensive evening gown around her ankles. She pulled the dress up with one hand while the other held her phone as she called security. No one knew which way Noah had gone. Her son's name stuck in her throat. But no one teaches a 5-year-old what to do when a whole ballroom looks at him like living proof of a sin he doesn't understand. The door to the mechanical basement shut heavily behind her. The air down there was colder, denser, and filled with the noise of pipes and ventilation units. Fluorescent lights trembled on the low ceiling. The smell of machine oil, hot rubber, and metal dust coated everything. Serena called her son's name down the long hallway, her voice hitting the ducts and breaking into echoes. A crooked sign on the left read Main Mechanical Room. On the floor she saw a small battery. She picked it up. It was from Noah's flashlight. Serena ran down the turn, her heart beating so hard it hurt behind her breastbone. She imagined every danger: an open stairwell, live wires, locked doors, a stranger taking her son, a reporter finding him before she did. Each image made her move faster. Her dress caught on the edge of a utility cabinet and tore a small line along her hip. Then she heard a child's voice, not crying, a small voice asking about copper wire and batteries, mixed with the steady sound of machinery. Serena slowed at the doorway of a secondary mechanical room. Yellow light from a maintenance bulb fell across the concrete floor. In the middle of the room, sitting cross-legged on a low toolbox, was Noah, his face still wet with tears but his breathing steadier. Beside him was a maintenance worker in a gray, grease-stained coverall, his cap pulled low, one sleeve rolled up in two neat folds. The man was holding the shell of the flashlight and showing Noah how to put the spring back in the right place. Noah had rolled up the right sleeve of his shirt in exactly two folds, too. The movement stopped Serena before she could call her son's name. The boy asked the worker if he knew how to fix everything. The man looked at those small hands longer than a normal question deserved. When he answered, his voice was rough and low, as if sound had to pass through years of being forbidden to speak. He said he had once known someone who did the same thing whenever he was concentrating. Serena took another step. The worker looked up. For the first few seconds, she didn't recognize him by his face. 6 years in the basement had taken too much. His jaw was harder now, his beard rough, his skin darker under the light, a small scar cutting through his left eyebrow. The loose coverall hid the body that had once stood in design rooms, wearing a white shirt with construction plans in his hands. But the eyes were old, and the way he looked at her, hurt and already pulling back, brought the entire past down through Serena like a glass wall shattering. Ethan Cole. The name slowly appeared in her mind like a wound that had never healed properly. The man she had once loved. The chief engineer had vanished after being accused of smuggling materials and embezzling project money. The man she had believed stole the money and left her with an 8-week pregnancy and a room full of unanswered calls. The man she had hated so she could keep living. And now he was right here, wearing a torn maintenance uniform in the mechanical level of the very building she ran, sitting beside her son as if she had always known how to calm him. Noah saw his mother and got down from the toolbox. Serena rushed over and wrapped him in her arms. She checked his face, hands, neck, and knees, as if counting every part of him would put the world back in place. Noah held onto her neck, his whole body still trembling from fear, but he wasn't screaming anymore. He said it was quieter down here. The mechanic asked hard questions. He just gave him the flashlight to fix. Serena pulled her son closer. Her eyes stayed locked on Ethan. He stood a few steps away, his arms lowered, his hands covered in calluses and small cuts. On the metal nameplate attached to his chest, the words Ethan C. had been scratched almost bare. She saw it, and the feeling of betrayal moved from the past into the present, hot enough to make her fingertips go numb. How long had he been here? How many times had he watched her walk by? Had he been under the same building on the nights she worked herself to exhaustion, the nights she carried Noah to the car between reporters, during the 5 years their child grew up, while she believed his father was a coward who had run away? Serena stood, still holding Noah close. She wanted to ask a dozen questions, but none of them could get past the anger. She saw that rainy night again 6 years ago, saw herself standing on the roadside, not showing yet, knocking on the window of the car he was leaving in. He hadn't rolled the window down. He hadn't explained. There had only been the red glow of brake lights and rain hitting the roof of the car. After that came the news of the admission of guilt, the revoked engineering license, and the silence where his words should have been. Serena's hand rose before she decided to lift it. Ethan didn't move away. That made it hurt even more. He stood still, as if a slap from her were something he had been waiting 6 years to receive. But before her hand touched his face, the radio clip to Ethan's shoulder crackled. Static mixed with a man's voice from security, filling the mechanical room. They were coming down to the mechanical level. They had orders to find the little bastard and bring him back out in front of the press. The shareholder's name was mentioned at the end, like a command no one even tried to hide. The air in the room changed. Ethan grabbed the radio and muted it, stepped to the door and looked through the crack. The sound of security shoes echoed from the far hallway. More than one person. Serena felt Noah clutch her dress. A few minutes earlier, her anger had wanted to push Ethan out of her life again. Now fear for her child forced her to stand still beside him. Ethan moved fast, as if he knew the place like someone who had lived inside the building's ribs. He pulled open a low ventilation grate behind the line of ducts, released the latch with a small screwdriver hidden in his pocket, then motioned for Serena to put Noah in first. Serena hesitated for half a second. She didn't trust him, she couldn't trust him. But the footsteps were getting closer and Noah was breathing too fast. She crouched down, holding her son, and slipped into the dark recess behind the pipes. The space inside was narrow and cold, the taste of metal dust sticking to her throat. Ethan crawled in last and pulled the grate back into place just as the security team's flashlights swept across the mechanical room. A man opened the door, stepped in, and lightly kicked the toolbox. Serena looked through the grate and saw the polished shoes of a guard less than 6 feet from her face. Noah started shaking. She covered her son's mouth with one hand, tears running down her face without making a sound. Ethan leaned in, blocking part of the gap with his shoulder. His hand covered Serena's mouth for a moment when her breathing grew too loud. The gesture made her go rigid, but he didn't hold it there. He only leaned close enough for her to hear him over the machines. He whispered that she couldn't let them see her with him. If a photo like that got out, her future, her seat, and even her right to protect Noah would be dragged into the mud before the night was over. Serena turned and looked at him in the dark. Ethan's face appeared only in pieces through the light slipping between the slats. No defense, no apology. Only the urgency of a man still thinking of her before himself. Outside security tore through the mechanical room, searching for the child they had called by the cruelest name possible. Inside, the man she had cursed for 6 years was using his own body to cover the gap in the light, as if being seen beside her was more dangerous than being caught. Serena didn't loosen her arms around Noah. She couldn't take her eyes off Ethan either. For the first time in 6 years, the hatred inside her didn't vanish, but another question cut through it. If he had really run away, why was he protecting her right now as if he had never left? Inside the ventilation recess behind the mechanical room, Serena Vale listened to the security team, passing by like an old sentence coming back to find her. Flashlights swept across the grate, slid over the silver ducts, then disappeared behind the sound of shoes striking concrete. Noah was pressed against her chest, his small hand gripping the torn fabric at her hip. Ethan Cole sat in front, blocking the outside, his shoulder almost touching the grate, one hand holding the screwdriver, the other pressed against the cold metal floor. Serena looked at that hand. 6 years earlier, that same hand had drawn structural lines on blueprints as if the building already existed inside his head. Now it was covered in cuts, hardened with calluses, and black grease was still under the nails. She didn't want to remember, but the tight darkness gave her nowhere to hide from the past. When Ethan had been chief engineer at Vale Urban Development, people called him the most irritating kind of genius, quiet, punctual, and almost always right. He didn't walk into meeting rooms with flash. He came in carrying drawing tubes, black coffee, and a shirt with the right sleeve rolled up in exactly 2 folds whenever he had to think through something difficult. Serena back then was the possible heir, newly returned from Chicago after 3 years managing urban projects. The shareholders looked at her like a last name, Vale. Ethan looked at her like someone who might misread the numbers if she were too tired. The first time they stayed at the office past midnight was during the old harbor redevelopment project. Serena wanted to add a block of moderate-income housing, even though the finance team said it would cut profit. Ethan didn't flirt with her. He only pulled a chair closer, set a revised load calculation in front of her, and pointed out a way to keep the units without breaking the foundation budget. At 3 a.m, as the cleaning staff passed through the hallway, Serena saw him tap his pencil 3 times against the edge of the table before every hard calculation. Months later, she would realize Noah did the same thing. Their love grew in service elevators, over cold coffee, in the way Ethan always placed the drawings in front of her before explaining them to the board. At the company, they kept their distance. Serena knew a relationship with the chief engineer would be turned by shareholders into proof that she wasn't professional enough. Ethan knew a woman climbing toward the top job wasn't allowed to have the same private life mistakes men got away with, so they loved each other in hidden pieces of time. Late dinners, messages before dawn, Ethan's jacket placed over Serena's shoulders when the model room got too cold. Preston Caldwell saw it all too, though he never watched like someone who was merely curious. Back then, he was the second largest shareholder, always talking about transparency and ethical governance in every meeting. He liked Serena in front of the cameras, but only while she still needed his approval. He liked Ethan fixing technical problems, but only while Ethan remembered he was an employee. What Preston couldn't stand was seeing them form an alliance he couldn't control. One person with the Vale name, one person with real skill. The trap wasn't built in one day. It began with small changes in materials procurement. A steel supplier was added to an emergency list. A temporary warehouse in New Jersey was approved with an electronic signature taken from Ethan's account while he was on site at a job. Invoices were split into multiple payments below the automatic audit threshold. Millions of dollars worth of materials vanished from the main shipping route and were then written off as technical loss. Ethan was the chief engineer, so every road on paper was designed to lead back to his desk. Preston understood the system better than people who thought he was just an investor. He knew which files accounting would check, which emails the internal lawyers would keep, and which warehouse cameras were usually overwritten after 30 days. He didn't need to invent a sloppy theft. He created a story believable enough for the board to want to accept. The brilliant chief engineer had abused his access, inflated loss numbers, moved materials out, and covered it with technical changes. Serena knew nothing in those first weeks. She was preparing for the interim succession vote after the old CEO developed heart problems. On her desk were a 5-year plan, an investor meeting calendar, and a pregnancy test in the bottom drawer. She hadn't told Ethan yet. Every time she saw him, she waited for a calmer moment. That moment never came. On the morning the internal investigation began, Ethan was ordered to turn over his computer. Legal came in with a data preservation notice. 2 people from audit stood behind them, and Preston sat at the end of the table with the sad expression of a man forced to witness a talent collapse. Ethan read the first file, then the second. He saw his electronic signature on warehouse release forms. He saw emails from his own account sent at 11:43 p.m., even though that night he had been fixing a pump system on a job site with no signal. He saw a transfer through a shell company tied to the old address of a cousin who had died. He understood at once that this wasn't a mistake. Mistakes don't line up that neatly. Ethan tried to meet with Serena, but her calendar had been locked down by communications in the board. Preston reached him first in the small conference room behind legal, the one with no windows and an internal recorder that was usually turned off for sensitive conversations. He placed another file in front of Ethan, thinner but more dangerous. Photos of Serena leaving Ethan's apartment, elevator access logs, emails they had exchanged after hours, and HR notes about a potential conflict of interest. If Ethan defended himself in court, Preston would drag Serena into every question. Why had she approved the design changes Ethan proposed? Why had she met him outside working hours? Why was she about to be appointed right when the material loss was discovered? With shareholders, the truth didn't need to be proven yet. It only needed to look dirty enough for the stock price to fall and the leadership seat to be pulled away from a woman already being doubted. Ethan sat across from Preston, both hands on his thighs. Preston gave him 2 choices. He could fight in public and let Serena be crushed under an investigation. Preston had already prepared for the media. Or he could accept responsibility, file an admission of professional misconduct, leave the construction industry, and let the company announce that this was the personal act of a greedy engineer with no connection to future leadership. Serena would be protected. Her seat would be safe. Her name wouldn't be dragged through the mud. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked through the frosted glass wall toward the hallway, where shadows of people passed without faces. He thought about Serena in her cream blazer, bent over drawings at 2 in the morning, trying to keep 12 more affordable units in a project even when everyone told her to let them go. He thought about the way she bit her lip when she was stressed. He didn't know she was pregnant. He only knew that if Preston pulled her into this, the people waiting for her to fall wouldn't need another reason. The admission letter had been drafted before Ethan agreed. He signed it with a black pen from legal under white lights. His engineering license was suspended first, then revoked after the disciplinary board. His name disappeared from the company website in one afternoon. His coworkers didn't call. Some were afraid. Some believed the file. Some were simply too busy trying to keep their own jobs. Serena found him the night he left his apartment. Rain poured over Boston like a thick curtain. She stood on the sidewalk, wet hair stuck to her cheeks. He had ignored dozens of her calls. She had learned about the admission of guilt and the pregnancy in the same week, before her body even had time to decide which pain to handle first. Ethan sat in a rented car, an old sedan that smelled like cigarettes. His suitcase was in the back seat. Serena slapped her palm against the window and called his name. She didn't understand why he wouldn't defend himself. She didn't understand why he had let her hear it from the lawyers. She didn't understand why the man who used to correct every wrong detail in a blueprint would accept such an impossible verdict. Ethan gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. If he rolled down the window, he would talk. If he talked, she wouldn't let him leave. If she didn't let him leave, Preston would have enough reason to drag her down with him. Serena cried in the rain, not quietly. She shouted, asking if he had really taken the money, if he had used her, if he was leaving because she was pregnant, or because he had only been waiting for the chance to walk away. Ethan heard each sentence like something sharp cutting through him. When she said she hated him, he closed his eyes for 1 second. That was the one sentence he needed her to keep. Hatred could hold her upright. The truth would send her back onto a battlefield. Preston had already mined. He drove away. In the rearview mirror, Serena stood in the road, growing smaller beneath the red lights. Ethan didn't know she had placed a hand on her stomach after his car turned the corner. He didn't know their son already existed in that world, too small to have a name, but already chosen as the reason Serena would be judged for years to come. He only knew he had left behind the one thing he had ever wanted to keep. In the months that followed, Ethan disappeared from the industry. No engineering company hired a man with a record like his. He repaired elevators for contract pay, replaced pipes, and serviced air conditioners in old buildings. He lived in a rented room in Revere, where the walls were thin and the windows rattled whenever the train went by. One morning, he read the news that Serena had officially become CEO. The article used a photo of her in a deep navy suit, her eyes tired but her chin raised. Ethan cut the article out, folded it, and kept it in his toolbox. That same day, he saw another photo on a tabloid site. Serena leaving a prenatal clinic, her pregnancy beginning to show. The headline guessed about the baby's father. Ethan sat in his maintenance van for nearly an hour, his hands on the wheel, without starting the engine. He came close to Serena and the child in the only way left, without destroying everything. A subcontractor needed a maintenance technician for the tower Vale had newly acquired. Ethan applied under his full name, but the title was low, the pay was low, and no one in leadership looked at the file. That tower later became the place where Serena placed her office and held major events. He started working night shifts in the basement. He fixed pumps, electrical panels, cameras, and backup network lines. He saw Serena through security monitors more often than in real life, carrying Noah when the boy was still tiny, walking through the lobby with a bottle in her bag, standing alone in the elevator after meetings where shareholders had questioned her private life. Ethan didn't step out. He didn't send a letter. He didn't call. Every time the thought came, he remembered the file in Preston's hand and the way the system could turn the truth into ammunition against Serena. He convinced himself that distance was the only protection he had left to give. If Noah grew up not knowing him, then that was the price Ethan had to pay for keeping the boy's mother in the seat that could protect them both. Now, inside the ventilation recess, Serena looked at Ethan's hand on the metal floor. A long scar ran from his wrist almost to his thumb, partly hidden by the frayed sleeve of his coverall. She recognized the way the right sleeve was rolled, 2 folds, neat to the point of obsession. Exactly like Noah when he had taken apart the flashlight. She looked closer at his gray uniform. The elbow had been patched with black thread. The old nameplate was worn at the edges. The shoulder seam had faded from years of scraping against ducts and utility doors. He hadn't abandoned them to live comfortably on stolen money. He had been living right beneath her building in the smell of machine oil and metal dust, repairing the invisible systems that kept her world lit. He had exiled himself underground, close enough to hear her name through the radio, but so far away he wasn't allowed to step into her life. Outside in the hallway, the security team's footsteps faded. Noah had fallen asleep from exhaustion, his face pressed against his mother's shoulder. Serena couldn't hold her anger in its old shape anymore. It cracked open, and underneath it were 6 years of misunderstanding, 6 years of using hatred as armor, and 6 years of him using silence as a shelter for her. One tear fell from Serena's chin and landed on the rough back of Ethan's hand. He looked at the tear, then at her, but still didn't dare touch her back. In that cramped darkness, Serena finally understood that the man she thought had left had never truly left at all. He had only stood in the lowest, darkest place and allowed the whole world to look down on him, as long as she and their son could keep walking in the light. The next morning, the Vale Tower woke up under the too clean light of Boston's financial district. The glass panels on the outside reflected a gray sky, while inside, the communications team had to pull clips from the gala out of the morning news one by one. But something that had been recorded didn't disappear just because a company issued a statement. The question about Serena Vale's son was already online, cut short, captioned, and passed around by people who had never met her but still believed they had the right to judge. Serena arrived at the office at 6:40. She wore an ivory white suit with a high collar, her hair pulled neatly back. From a distance, she was still the festal CEO who had carried Vale Urban Development through 3 straight quarters of growth. But inside the private elevator, her hand gripped the folder so hard the edge of the paper pressed into her skin. The night before, Noah had slept in her bed with one hand around the flashlight Ethan had put back together. Every time the boy turned in his sleep, she saw Ethan's face under the yellow light in the basement. The board meeting had been moved up by an hour. Preston Caldwell called it a necessary response to a media crisis. He sat across from Serena in a charcoal suit, wearing the solemn face of a man protecting shareholders from a problem he had created himself. In front of him was a file stamped in red. Leadership image risk, proposed confidence vote. Serena sat in the chairperson's seat, her back straight, her eyes moving across every member of the board. She knew if her voice cracked even once, Preston would turn it into proof that she wasn't stable enough. So she talked about contracts, pending project approvals, and the stock price before market open. She didn't mention Noah. Not mentioning him was what made her throat hurt. 10 minutes in, the air conditioning in the conference room began to rattle. Cold air pushed down over the glass table, making several board members pull their jackets closer. Preston glanced up at the ceiling vent, then asked maintenance to come up immediately, his voice just polite enough that no one could call it a dirty command. Serena understood before the door even opened. Under the table, her nails dug into her palm. Ethan came in with a younger technician. He wore gray coveralls, a tool bag over his shoulder, his cap pulled low. A few eyes passed over him and returned to the screen. Preston looked longer. At first it was recognition, then it was a pleasure hidden under a frown. Ethan placed an aluminum ladder beneath the vent, opened the filter panel, and checked the control wiring. But Serena saw the tendon in his wrist tighten every time Preston turned his hot coffee cup between two fingers. Preston started talking about market trust. He didn't say Ethan's name directly in the first minute. He only said the company couldn't allow ghosts from old scandals to keep wandering through its infrastructure. Ethan stayed on the ladder, tightening the filter screw. Serena saw his shoulder stay still. Then Preston dropped the coffee cup. Not really dropped it. His wrist tilted too slowly for it to be an accident. Hot coffee spilled in a brown streak across the cream carpet. A support staff member started to step forward, but Preston raised a hand to stop them. He looked at Ethan on the ladder and asked the maintenance man to handle the stain right away, in the voice of someone speaking to equipment instead of a person. The whole room went quiet. Ethan climbed down. He took a towel from his tool bag and lowered one knee onto the carpet. The coffee sank fast into the fabric, leaving an ugly stain in the middle of the boardroom. Steam rose and touched the back of his hand. He didn't pull away. He blotted the spot bit by bit, pressed the towel down, flipped it over, then took a small cleaning solution from his bag. Serena sat less than 10 feet away. She could see a red mark rising on his hand where the coffee had touched him. She also saw Preston lean back just enough to show satisfaction. The whole room was waiting for her to react. One sentence defending Ethan, and Preston would have another blade. The CEO protects the disgraced man. Ethan looked up only once. His eyes didn't ask her to save him. They were calm, exhausted, and almost ordering her to stay seated. As if his kneeling at the feet of the man who had ruined his life was only part of a larger calculation. As if he was still telling her to hold on to the chair, to hold on to the only power that could protect Noah. Serena placed her other hand on the file to hide the nail marks in her palm. She continued her presentation about Project Cash Flow. Her voice didn't break. But when Ethan stood with a dirty towel in his hand, she couldn't see the numbers anymore. She only saw 6 years of him being pushed down, and the man who had pushed him still sitting at the head of the table, speaking in the language of governance. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Preston proposed a special confidence vote that afternoon. He didn't need the majority to speak right away. He only needed to plant enough doubt for frightened people to start looking for a way to stand away from Serena. When the meeting ended, no one looked directly at her for long. Ethan had disappeared before then, taking his tool bag and the coffee-stained towel with him, but he didn't go back to the basement to bow his head. He knew which pipes ran behind the boardroom, which cameras recorded video but didn't store sound, and which backup server still held copies of data older than the main retention policy. On B3, there was a mechanical storage room that didn't appear on the newer plans. Ethan had used it as his underground line of defense for years. On the old folding table were an industrial laptop, removable drives, network cables, and a stack of handwritten notebooks marked by date. They were the map of a man who had once been framed by the system and had learned how to move inside that system without making a sound. Ethan hadn't been passive. From the day he realized Preston was still using the same group of contractors, the same shell company structure, and the same money routes disguised as material costs, he had started saving small pieces. An email was backed up by mistake. An Excel file with original metadata still inside. A side warehouse camera catches a truck arriving at the wrong hour. A scan of a release form with a timestamp from before his electronic signature had been used. Each piece alone wasn't enough. But 5 years is a long time for a man who can read infrastructure like a blueprint. Serena appeared at the mechanical storage room door after noon. There was only the ivory white suit and a face so tired that makeup couldn't hide it. Ethan wasn't surprised. She looked around the room at the pinboard covered with timelines, license plates, and the names of intermediary companies. In one corner of the board was the old article about Serena becoming CEO. This time she didn't come to slap him. The anger was still there, but beneath it was understanding. She looked at the red burn on his hand. Ethan slapped a bandage over it carelessly, his eyes still locked on the code running across the screen. He had found the backup server that held a snapshot from 6 years ago. If he could retrieve the original data, he could prove the electronic signature had been used from another location, prove the invoices had been altered after approval, and prove the money hadn't flowed to him, but through a chain of companies tied to Preston. When you watch a father kneel and wipe up coffee in front of his enemy, just so the woman he loves won't lose the chair that can protect their son, the tightness in your chest doesn't come from one grand tragedy. It comes on a silent silence of the whole room. Some sacrifices don't need a declaration. They live in a burned hand and in the way a person still chooses to protect someone else while he himself is being ground into the floor. Stay with me a little longer, because the man in the basement is rebuilding the truth from the scraps of data the powerful man thought he had buried. Serena stood behind him for a long time. On the screen, old folders appeared. Procurement Archive, Emergency Steel Supply, Harbor Phase 2. Now they opened with dates, IP addresses, access accounts, and approval paths. Ethan didn't tell long stories about what he had suffered. He pointed to a chain of transaction codes and a company name in Delaware. Serena recognized the company. It had once appeared in one of Preston's side investments. The truth didn't arrive like thunder. It came as a cold spreadsheet. Serena looked at each row of numbers, each attachment, each timestamp, and saw 6 years of her life bent out of shape by deliberate lines of data. She thought of Noah being called a bastard before the gala. She thought of Ethan kneeling to wipe up coffee. She thought of Preston preparing to sit before the board that afternoon and ask to strip her power away in the language of ethics. On the 48th floor, Preston was preparing too. He asked communications to draft a statement about a temporary transition, emphasizing stability, shareholder trust, and leadership responsibility. He didn't have the official votes yet, but he had enough fear. A few board members had agreed to attend. 2 were still undecided. He sent them links to the gala clips spreading online. All he needed was to show them the stock opening lower, and cautious investors would find their own sacrifice. Ethan ran the final data copy onto an encrypted USB drive. The progress bar crawled slowly across the screen. Serena received a text from her assistant. The vote would begin in 20 minutes. She looked at the clock, then at Ethan. That was when the secondary access alert flashed in the corner of the screen. Someone had opened the server room door. Ethan stood at once. On the small camera mounted under the table, the B3 hallway appeared. 3 men in black suits, not technicians, walking with the internal security manager. One of them held a short metal pipe hidden along his leg. Preston wasn't waiting for the vote result to clean out the basement. For a few quick seconds, Ethan checked everything like he was checking a structural plan before a storm. The storage room door had 2 latches. Behind him was a pressure release valve. On the left was a dry chemical fire extinguisher. On the right was a secondary electrical panel. He wasn't a fighter, but this room was his territory. Every pipe, every switch could buy time for the data. Serena grabbed her phone to call the police, but Ethan stopped her with a shake of his head. If she appeared in the call log before the evidence was complete, Preston would say she had staged it. She needed to be in the boardroom on time, in front of the board, as if she knew nothing. Ethan pulled out the unfinished backup USB and placed it in her hand. It was missing the key file, but it still contained enough of the dirty money trail. She didn't want to leave, but he didn't give her a soft choice. His eyes told her that if she stayed, they would both lose. If she went, then at least Noah would still have one person on the 48th floor to stop Preston in front of the shareholders. Serena went through the side door leading to the freight elevator just as the men opened the main door of the mechanical storage room. She only had time to see Ethan standing in the middle of the room, gray coveralls on, one hand still on the table, the screen behind him glowing blue. The door closed between them. On the way up, Serena heard the freight elevator tremble around her. She looked at the small line of blood in her palm from her own nails, then closed her fingers around it. Her anger didn't rise like fire now. It froze into something colder, something more useful. She couldn't save Ethan by running back downstairs. She could only keep the room upstairs from condemning him a second time under Preston's false language of stability and ethics. In the storage room, the security manager saw the laptop, the pin board, and the hard drives. The 3 men spread out, blocking the door and the entrance to the pump room. A metal pipe slid out of a sleeve with a short scrape of steel. Ethan pulled the screwdriver from his pocket, not like a weapon, but out of the habit of a man holding the thing he understood best. On the screen, the last file was still encrypting. On the 48th floor, the board began entering the glass conference room. Preston stood at the head of the table with the prepared statement in his hand. Serena stepped out of the elevator, no tears on her face, one hand gripping the incomplete USB inside her jacket pocket. Underground, Ethan was surrounded by pipes and the sound of pumps. If he fell before the data finished sealing, Serena would walk into the boardroom with only half the truth, and Preston would have enough power to bury the rest. Down on B3, Ethan Cole stood in the middle of the secondary server room, listening to 3 men lock down the exits with short, steady steps. On the screen behind him, the encryption bar had only a few % left. The USB drive plugged into the side of the laptop blinked with the tiny blue light, small against the steel pipes and electrical panels. The security manager in front wasn't wearing the building's guard uniform. He wore a black suit, a dark tie, and a private radio in his ear. The other 2 men stood off to the sides, each holding a short metal pipe, the kind of thing that could be called a tool if anyone needed to lie to the police. Ethan didn't step back. He only looked past their shoulders, measuring the distance to the pressure release valve behind the line of cooling pipes. After 5 years in maintenance, he had learned that every building had a body. It breathed through vents, circulated through water pumps, remembered through servers, and hurt in places no one saw. A person who understood that body didn't need to be stronger than the men in front of him. He only needed to know where to touch the nerve. The security manager came first. Ethan let him get 2 steps closer. When the first pipe swung, Ethan shifted away in a reflex that wasn't pretty but worked, then drove his foot hard into the emergency release lever beneath the valve panel. A loud hiss tore through the room. High-pressure steam burst from the pipe beside them, white and thick, hot enough to force the 2 men with pipes backward. The technical alarm flashed red across the control panel. Ethan didn't charge them. He didn't have time for that. He grabbed the dry chemical fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, pulled the pin, and aimed the nozzle at the floor right in front of their shoes. A heavy cloud of white powder shot out, coating the concrete and leather soles. One man slipped when he tried to rush through it. His pipe slammed into the edge of the server cabinet with a sharp metallic clang. Ethan threw his shoulder into the auxiliary cabinet door, knocking it open across the path. Behind him, the computer gave a short beep. The encryption finished at the last second. Ethan turned, pulled the USB from the machine, and yanked the external drive from the dock at the same time. A strike grazed his back, pain cutting from shoulder to ribs, but he kept the data tight in his hand. The security manager cursed through the white powder and called into his radio. Ethan reached across to the secondary electrical panel, killed the hallway light circuit, and triggered the magnetic lock on the technical door. The room lights flickered once and shifted to emergency mode. The main door closed heavily, trapping the men in the place they thought they controlled. He didn't beat them with strength. He only bought himself 3 minutes. Those 3 minutes were enough for him to slip through the maintenance hatch behind the pump cluster, a hatch only longtime techs knew could be opened from the inside with a screwdriver. His back hurt. Steam made the coverall cling to his skin. His left hand was bleeding across the knuckles from hitting the cabinet edge. But the USB was still in his inner pocket, pressed against his chest like the last piece of evidence that couldn't be allowed to fall. On the 48th floor, the glass boardroom was full. Boston Harbor, beyond the large windows, was covered in gray clouds, but inside, the white ceiling lights exposed every face. Preston Caldwell stood at the head of the table, a resignation file placed directly in front of Serena Vale's chair. Third board members sat in 2 rows, some looking sympathetic, staring down at their papers as if they were afraid their eyes would be recorded in the minutes. Serena entered when the meeting had already been underway for 3 minutes. She was still wearing the ivory white suit, but one cuff had a small crease from running through the freight elevator. Inside her jacket was the unfinished USB Ethan had given her. It wasn't enough to end Preston yet, but it was enough to remind her that beneath the building, someone was trading his body for the rest of the truth. Preston didn't need to shout. He used the voice of a man doing something cruel on behalf of an institution. He presented image risk, an ethics crisis, and the market reaction if the company continued to be led by someone whose private life overshadowed governance. The word son wasn't used often. The word child appeared only once. Everything else was wrapped in management language: shareholder trust, fiduciary responsibility, executive stability. Serena sat down in the chairperson's seat. She didn't touch the resignation file. An internal lawyer read the special voting procedure. Preston placed a pen near her hand as if all she had to do was sign, and the room could breathe again and call it a civilized transition. Serena looked at the pen, then around the table. Some of these people had seen her keep projects from collapsing. Some had shaken her hand when profits rose. Now they were waiting for her to disappear so the company would be less noisy. Preston pushed the file a few inches closer. That tiny gesture finally made Serena stand. Her chair slid back over the floor with a dry, clear sound. Her face was so cold the room stopped before she even spoke. She didn't pick up the pen. She placed both hands on the glass table and looked at Preston the way someone looks at a building cracked from the foundation, but painted over in a pretty color. The boardroom door opened before he could answer. Ethan walked in wearing gray coveralls stained with oil and fire extinguisher powder, his hair damp, one shoulder torn, his left hand bleeding. He didn't look like a maintenance worker who had permission to appear on the executive floor. He looked like a piece of the building had stepped out of the ground to testify. Behind him, 2 of Serena's security staff and an IT technician rushed in, pale from the internal system breach. No one in the room spoke for the first few seconds. Preston was the first to change color, just slightly in the hard line of his jaw and the way his hand closed over the file. But Ethan saw it. Serena saw it too. Ethan went straight to the presentation screen. He didn't ask permission. He plugged the USB into the system, typed the key string with his right hand, his fingers tapping 3 times before he hit enter. Serena saw the motion, and her throat tightened. On the screen, the Vail logo disappeared. An encrypted folder opened. The evidence didn't arrive like some glamorous movie scene. It appeared as transaction tables, email chains, subcontractor agreements, metadata, IP addresses, scanned release forms, and a money flow map. That coldness was what made the room unable to look away. Each piece was arranged by time. 6 years earlier, a shell company was created in Delaware. 3 weeks later, an emergency steel contract was added to the system. Ethan's electronic signature was used from an IP address that didn't belong to his device. Shipments were moved through a side warehouse. Payments were split into amounts below the alert threshold. Finally, the money moved through 2 layers of intermediary companies and back to an account connected to a personal fund managed by Preston's longtime assistant. One board member pulled his glasses down the bridge of his nose. The internal lawyer stood up. No one needed Ethan to explain it with a long speech. The file did that by itself. Footage from a side warehouse camera appeared next, showing a truck leaving the dock at 3:17 a.m., its license plate matching an invoice that had been altered. Then came access logs proving Ethan's account had been opened while his entry badge showed him at the Southern job site. Every line of data removed one brick from the story Preston had built. Serena took out her phone, placed it on the table, and turned on the speaker for a call that had already been connected to the Financial Crimes Unit and independent legal counsel. She hadn't run downstairs to save Ethan with emotion. She had done what a CEO should do when there was evidence: lock the record, gather witnesses, and bring investigators in at the moment Preston couldn't leave the room. The boardroom door opened a second time. 2 investigators in dark jackets entered with the Boston police. This time, the sound of chairs shifting broke the order in the room. Preston stood too quickly, making the pen roll off the table and fall to the floor. He spoke about fabricated documents, a vengeful former employee, and illegally stolen data. But his voice no longer had that smooth velvet layer. It scraped now, exposing the metal underneath. Ethan stood beside the screen and didn't interrupt. He had done his part. Serena did the rest. She sent the data copy to the investigators in front of the board and requested that the backup servers, procurement files, Preston's accounts, and the related vendor chain be sealed. Each request was specific, exact, delivered in the voice of a woman who had taken back the center of the room. No one was looking at her anymore as a woman who needed to be replaced because of a scandal. They were looking at her as the only person in the room who still understood how to save the company. Preston tried to pull one board member to his side, but the man withdrew his hand. His allies began turning into witnesses. The lawyer who had been sitting beside him stepped back half a pace and opened his phone to call his own firm. The media wasn't there yet, but everyone knew this scandal would no longer revolve around Serena. It had changed owners. When the police moved toward him, Preston looked at Serena one last time with hatred he couldn't hide. The man who had used her private life as a weapon suddenly had no moral language left to hide behind. Handcuffs locked around his wrists under the white lights of the glass boardroom. The metal sound was short, but it passed through the room like the period at the end of 6 years of lies. Serena stepped away from the chairperson's seat. She didn't go near Preston first. She walked to Ethan's side and looked at the blood on his hand, the white powder in his hair and the tear at his shoulder. Then she turned back toward the board. She didn't need a long speech. She placed the right answer into the stain Preston had tried to use to ruin her life. The man standing beside her was Ethan Cole, the best chief engineer the company had ever had, a man framed to hide an embezzlement scheme and the father of her son. She said it not as a confession, but as the restoration of someone's honor. The room went silent, but this time the silence didn't press down on Serena. It pressed down on the people who had believed too quickly, stayed quiet too long, and let an innocent man be pushed into the basement because the truth was inconvenient. An older board member took off his glasses and set them on the table. Another lowered his head. No one mentioned the word bastard again. That word, after being thrown at a 5-year-old boy, died in the same place where it had been born. Preston was taken out of the boardroom. As he passed Ethan, he stopped for 1 second, maybe wanting to say something final. But Ethan didn't look at him. He looked through the glass where rain was sliding down the city in thin lines. The man who had destroyed his life wasn't large enough anymore to hold his gaze. The investigators began working. They collected laptops, requested boardroom data backups, and made a list of everyone present. The board temporarily suspended every motion against Serena. Another emergency meeting was scheduled with independent counsel. Everything returned to the rhythm of corporate life after an explosion. Minutes, preservation orders, lawyers, audits, statements. Justice wasn't fireworks. It was a system being forced to look at the truth. Serena looked for Ethan in the middle of that chaos. He was no longer standing beside the screen. On the table, right in front of her empty chair, was a gray maintenance employee badge. The photo on it was old, the plastic edges scratched, the title reading maintenance technician. Beside the badge were the backup USB and the small screwdriver he always carried. She looked toward the door. Ethan was walking toward the service hallway, one hand holding his side, his back straight but exhausted. Serena called his name. This time, his name rang through the glass boardroom, in front of the people who had once erased it from the company website. Ethan stopped, but he didn't turn around right away. In that moment, he looked like a man who had been too far underground and wasn't sure he had the right to step into the light. When he turned back, there was no victory in his eyes, only exhaustion and the sad calm of a person who believed the final job was done. He said very little. He had returned what belonged to her: the chair, the truth, her name, her ability to protect Noah. The rest in his mind didn't belong to him anymore. 6 years of silence had created a distance he didn't dare cross. Serena stepped toward him, but an investigator called her over to sign the chain of custody confirmation for the data. An assistant brought her the phone because a child psychologist needed to talk about Noah. The board needed her to stay. The company needed her to stay. The whole world she had just won back pulled her into its place. Ethan saw all of it. He understood too well how heavy that chair was, so he only nodded. the same way he had 6 years ago in the windowless room. Then he turned and walked out through the door, taking nothing with him except torn coveralls and unbandaged wounds. Serena stood in the boardroom she had just saved, watching the man who had saved it disappear down the hallway, and for the first time, victory tasted like loss. Serena Vale's victory didn't sound like applause. It came through procedures that dragged on until evening, data handoff records, calls with independent lawyers, an emergency statement sent to shareholders, and a list of accounts that had to be frozen before Preston Caldwell could touch them. When she left the 48th floor, the glass boardroom still glowed white behind her, like an operating room after surgery, with the tools still lying everywhere, stained with blood. On the internal newsfeed, her position was preserved. The board temporarily suspended all of Preston's voting rights. The financial crimes investigators began sealing the servers. People who had avoided her eyes that morning now stood up to shake her hand, their voices lowered, careful respect returning very quickly. Serena had seen that kind of color change too many times to mistake it for loyalty. She got back to the penthouse close to midnight. The apartment sat high above the city, looking down through spotless glass walls. Everything there was beautiful. Walnut floors, built-in bookshelves, a white stone kitchen, and abstract paintings, selected by an art advisor to match the color palette. But when the door closed behind her, none of that beauty made the place warmer. Noah was sitting on the living room rug, the repaired flashlight resting on his knees. He didn't ask about the shareholders, and he didn't ask why his mother was on so many people's phones. He only asked if the mechanic was hurt. The question made Serena take off her shoes very slowly. All day, she had kept her back straight in front of the board, the lawyers, and the people who had been ready to push her out of her seat. But in front of her son, that armor began to fall off. She sat down beside Noah. The boy tapped his index finger 3 times against the metal shell of the flashlight, then placed it in her lap like something he wanted her to keep safe. That night, after Noah fell asleep, Serena stood in the kitchen and looked at the flashlight on the stone counter. Ethan had given her back the company, her honor, and the truth. But he had left like a man who didn't believe he still had the right to ask for anything back. Victory had let her keep the chairperson's seat, but her apartment was still missing the sound of someone's footsteps. Noah was still missing the father who had sat beside him in the mechanical room, gentle enough not to ask questions that scared children. The next morning, Serena told her assistant to clear every personal appointment after 3 in the afternoon. She didn't bring a driver. She drove herself out of downtown Boston, past the glass towers, past neighborhoods where the buildings grew lower, toward Revere, where Ethan had once lived in a rented room still listed in his personnel file. Noah sat in the back, both hands holding the flashlight. On the way, he looked out the window for a long time. He didn't know enough of the past to be afraid of Ethan. Children sometimes recognize safety before adults gather enough evidence. To Noah, that man was the one who had put the spring back where it belonged, spoken softly in a noisy room, and hadn't looked at him like a mistake. Ethan's rooming house stood behind an old auto garage, where the sign had faded from sea salt and wind. The outside iron stairs were rusted at the edges, trash bins sat by the back door, and the smell of machine oil and cheap coffee clung to the air. Serena stopped at the curb, turned off the engine, and looked up at the second-floor window with a gray curtain pulled crookedly to one side. She had once thought he had vanished into an easy life bought with dirty money. The truth was that he had lived somewhere where everything was thin: walls, doors, money, and sleep. Ethan opened the door after the second knock. He wore an old t-shirt and work pants, one side of his ribs bandaged beneath the fabric, bruising reaching up to he hadn't shaved, and his eyes were dark from lack of sleep. When he saw Serena, he didn't look surprised. Maybe he had known she would come. Maybe he had only feared she wouldn't. Noah stepped out from behind his mother before the adults could say anything. The boy lifted the flashlight with both hands. The casing had been wiped clean, the battery cap screwed on right, and the switch was working again. Noah tapped his index finger 3 times against the metal, the small habit sounding through the quiet hallway of the rooming house. Ethan looked at the motion. His face changed before he could control it. 6 years of silence, 6 years of standing beneath the building watching his son grow through lobby cameras and chance moments, 6 years of telling himself distance was the only way to protect them. All of it dropped to his knees. He knelt right there in the doorway, slowly like a man afraid that if he moved too fast, the child would disappear. Noah didn't step back. He moved closer, placed the flashlight in Ethan's hands, then wrapped his arms around Ethan's neck with a strange trust of blood that had never been named. Ethan held his son for the first time. At first, he tried to keep it gentle, like holding something precious that might break. Then his shoulders shook. His crying wasn't loud, but it made Serena turn her face away for a moment. There was no heroism in that moment. Only a father 6 years late, finally allowed to place his hand on the back of the child he had protected from the dark. Serena stood in the doorway, gripping the folder. She had prepared so much to say, but when she saw Ethan holding Noah, every word felt too polished. She only placed the folder on the small table in his room after he invited them in. Ethan's room was tidy in a way that hurt. One twin bed, an old desk, a small electric burner, and several technical notebooks stacked neatly. A construction calendar hung on the wall, and below it sat his toolbox. Serena saw a tin box on the shelf. Inside were old newspaper clippings about the company. The day she took office, the day the South Boston project was approved, and a photo of her carrying Noah when he was 3, taken outside the building lobby. Not proof of obsession. The remains of a man who had lived on the small pieces he was allowed to see. The folder Serena brought wasn't an emotional gift. It was an official decision from the interim board after the emergency meeting. Ethan's name would be restored in the internal record. Legal support would be provided to help him seek reinstatement of his engineering license, and he would be appointed vice president of engineering, with authority to review the entire contractor, procurement, and infrastructure system. The salary was written clearly. A compensation clause for 6 years of professional loss was placed in the appendix. Everything had gone through lawyers with signatures, responsibility, and real consequences for the company that had let him be buried. Ethan read each page slowly. When he saw the new title, he didn't smile. He placed his hand over the words Vice President of Engineering as if he wasn't sure they were allowed to belong to him. Serena didn't force him to accept right away. She knew honor could be taken quickly, but learning to believe you deserved it back took longer. She said little. She told him Preston would be prosecuted, independent auditors would reopen every contract from his time in control, and the company needed someone who understood both the blueprints and the basement. But more than that, she and Noah needed him to step into the light, not as a debt, not as someone forgiven to make the story look better, as the person who should have been standing there from the beginning. Ethan looked at Noah. The boy was sitting on the edge of the bed, taking the flashlight cap off and putting it back on, tapping 3 times on the metal shell every time he concentrated. Ethan looked at Serena. His eyes still held the self-doubt of a man who had lived too long under the title maintenance worker, but beneath it, something was returning very slowly. The feeling that he wasn't just a mistake in someone else's file. He didn't accept that afternoon. He asked for time. Serena agreed. The first thing she had to learn again about love was not to pull someone who had been sacrificed for too long into the light by yanking hard. She let Noah hug Ethan one more time before they left. When the boy let go, Ethan placed the flashlight back in his hands, but Noah shook his head and left it on Ethan's table. A small object, but enough to give that rented room something to wait for him to come back. 3 weeks later, Ethan walked into the Vale Tower through the front entrance. Not the basement door, not the freight elevator. He wore a dark gray suit and still wasn't used to the new shirt collar, his right hand unconsciously beginning to roll up his sleeve before Serena placed her hand on his wrist. The gesture made him stop, not to hide himself, but to remember he didn't need to be ready to run anymore. Ethan's restored honor was announced in the internal investigation report. The company acknowledged serious failures in oversight, cooperated with investigators, and created a compensation fund for employees harmed by Preston's contractor network. Several board members resigned. Procurement was restructured. None of it looked beautiful like a movie. It was paperwork, meetings, hearings, long, exhausting days. But that was what gave justice a spine. 1 year later, the first project Serena and Ethan publicly led together opened in South Boston. It was a mixed-use complex with moderate-income housing, small commercial spaces for local businesses, and an energy-efficient infrastructure system overseen by Ethan. The ceremony was held outdoors under thin early fall sunlight. Cameras were still there. Shareholders were still there. The city's upper class still knew how to stand in the front row. But this time they weren't looking at Serena like a scandal. Serena wore a cream suit. Ethan stood beside her in a fitted suit, his hair clean, the scar on his eyebrow still there but not making him look lower than anyone. Noah stood between them, one hand holding his mother's hand, the other holding his father's. In the small pocket of his jacket was the old flashlight. When a reporter asked him what part of the new building he liked most, Noah didn't mention the playground or the glass elevators. He said the mechanical room was very clean, and his dad said the pump system ran really smoothly. Ethan bent down to straighten his son's collar. Noah tapped 3 times on the back of his father's hand. Ethan tapped back 3 times, softer. Serena looked at father and son and saw that 6 years of loss hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined their family. No one in the crowd dared to mention the word that had been thrown at Noah during the gala. Standing before them wasn't a shameful secret anymore. It was a family close enough that no one could force their way between them again. If I had to keep one image from this story, it wouldn't be the moment Preston was put in handcuffs or the day Ethan walked back into the company with a new title. I think about the little flashlight lying in that rented room in Revere, something a child left behind for his father as a way of saying, I'm coming back. Some people sacrifice for so long that they forget they deserve to be called home too. And some truths, no matter how many layers of concrete they're buried under, still find their way into the light when love is patient enough to wait for them. Serena's and Ethan's story isn't a fairy tale about changing your life overnight. It's a reminder that dignity doesn't live in a suit or a maintenance uniform. Dignity lives in what a person is willing to endure to protect the people they love, and in the moment the other person is brave enough to return, not to pity them, but to take their hand and keep walking. If you've ever quietly been someone's shield, I hope one day someone realizes how long you've been standing there. And if you have someone like that in your life, don't wait until they're exhausted before you say their name. Sometimes a thank you at the right time, a hand that doesn't pull away, or standing beside them in front of others is enough to pull a person out of the darkness they've grown used to carrying. Not everyone needs to be saved by power. Some people only need to be seen for the love they've been carrying quietly for a very long time.